You know, it's not easy to keep your attention when I'm preaching. And sometimes it's not easy for me to keep my attention when I'm preaching. Just to give you an example, years ago, right when I was beginning my homily, a lady's phone began to ring. And you know, it was one of those annoying, ringtones. And so I'm beginning to preach, and I noticed, and she was like in the second row, she was really up close. So I noticed she was fumbling in her purse to get it. And so as I'm preaching, I'm thinking, okay, good, she's looking for her phone, she's going to turn it off really quick. But she didn't turn it off. She answered it. And she was having a conversation while I was preaching. And so the attention of the congregation stopped with me and started looking at her. The attention was on her now. My attention was on her. And the conversation was something like, hello? Hello? Yeah, I can hear you. No, I'm at church. Yeah, I'll come over afterwards. No, I don't know when I'll be over there. The priest is preaching right now. It depends how long he takes. I don't know. Yeah, I haven't forgotten. I'll go to the grocery store afterwards. Yeah. All right, I'll see you then. All right, bye. And she puts it in there and she looks at me, right out, as if nothing had happened. So I'm looking at her, she's looking at me, and I forgot my homily. Talk about attention. And so I just calmly went to the next part of the Mass. Well, this challenge of keeping people's attention goes back to the very beginning, especially with preaching. Even in the time of Jesus, rabbis had the challenge of keeping the attention of the congregation. And they had a method. It was called charaz, or charaz, however you pronounce it. And it means, literally, stringing beads. And the method was that whatever thought or idea that you would have, you didn't stay on it for very long. And so they were like little beads, and you would just string those beads on to keep the people's attention. And I mentioned that because we have an example of that in today's gospel. Jesus is using that rabbinic method of preaching in his Sermon on the Plain. The charaz, the stringing of beads, and he's doing it by way of the parables. The blind leading the blind, with the splinter and the wooden beam in the eye, with the tree that produces good fruit, and then the one that we don't hear about, with the house that's built on the firm foundation. And all of these are good thoughts and ideas. And so I'm going to attempt to keep your attention by focusing on one of them. One of those beads. And that's the second one. Jesus begins by asking a question. Why is it that you notice the splinter in your neighbor's eye, but then you don't perceive the wooden beam in your own? Scholars in the past have referred to that as the passing the buck parable. You've heard that expression before, right? Passing the buck. That goes back to the time of the Old West. The buck wasn't, like a dollar bill. The buck was actually from buckshot. Buckshot actually looks like beads. Speaking of stringing the beads together. And they would use it in poker games. You know, the men would play their poker, and they would pass the buck, that bead, to the person who would be responsible for dealing the deck. And you've heard then the buck stops here, right? So then the responsibility stops here. But we've been passing the buck since the beginning of time. We've been passing the buck since Adam and Eve. You remember the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? God comes looking for them. Adam, where are you? And Adam says, I'm hiding in shame because I'm naked. And God says, who told you you're naked? Did you eat of that fruit that I told you not to eat? And you know what he said? She made me do it. She ate it first. And so God asked Eve, why? Why did you eat the fruit? Uh-oh, that's right, uh-oh. You know what she said? The serpent made me do it. He tempted me, told me I'd have all this knowledge. Kind of reminds me of Flip Wilson. The devil made me do it. Right? And we still do it today, passing the buck. You know, I call it the society of blame. It's that idea that, you know, the problem is on the outside of ourselves. And so we blame whatever the problem is, especially if it's others, that we blame the other. The problem is outside. You see, the problem with the society of blame is that we can't correct it, or there's very little that we can do in correcting something that's outside of ourselves. We don't have power over the other person, or very little. But if we look first from within, if we see that there is the problem from within first, then we have the ability to correct, the ability to transform and change from within. We have the ability to grab a hold of what it is. The problem is taking place. And then when we change that problem, we transform that problem, then it affects outside of ourselves. There is no conflict in the world that does not first happen from within. I remember an article, it was written by John Killinger. He was telling about a minor league baseball manager. He was so frustrated with his center field player that he called him off the field, put him in the dugout, and he went out and assumed the position himself. He went out and played himself. And so he's out there in the field playing the game, and one of the balls came towards him. And it made a bad bounce and hit him right in the mouth. And then there was another ball that came. It was a high fly. But then he lost it in the glare of the sun, and it came down and hit him in the forehead. And then there was another ball that came, and it was kind of like a line drive, and it went right between his hands and socked him in the eye. And he got so frustrated, he went back into the dugout and grabbed a hold of his outfielder, and he says, "You blockhead, you've messed up outfield so much, I can't even do anything with it." Correction begins from within. The buck stops here. remove the wooden beam from your own eye first. Then you will see clearly enough to remove the splinter in your neighbor's eye. Amen?
Amen.
God bless you.